Hello, everybody. My name is Matt DeVerna. I'm a PhD candidate here at Indiana University. And I'm very happy to welcome you all again to another Observatory and Social Media Awesome Speakers event. Before we get started, as I usually do, I'll sort of introduce the Observatory and talk about the speaker series really quickly if happens to be your first time crossing paths with us. So the Observatory on Social Media, or OSoMe as the acronym is pronounced, is a joint project of the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering with the Media School at IU. OSoMe is an interdisciplinary research group that is interested in all things at the intersection of media and technology, with a particular focus on social media. We conduct rigorous academic research, build analytical tools and software for both scientists and journalists, and work to educate the next generation of computationally skilled media professionals. So if you're interested in learning more about the observatory, we have a link to the website there at the bottom of the slide, awesome.iu.edu. And you can learn about the latest research we have, new tools that we're developing, and really anything else going on with the observatory. As part of the observatory's interdisciplinary mission, we've organized the Awesome Speakers virtual event. This is essentially meant to be just sort of a kind of a collection of talks from some of the brightest researchers and scholars who are working to rigorously understand how social media, the internet, and technology impact the world. So we've had a number of talks already, and we still have a few left for this semester. If you're interested in learning about the ones we have coming up or seeing some of the recordings of the previous talks, you can go to the website, and there'll be a link to the YouTube playlist for most of those talks. If you find today's talk interesting, I'm sure you'll be interested in some of the other talks as well. And the link to that page is at the bottom of the slide here. So now for the fun stuff, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Starbird. Kate is an associate professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Kate's research sits at the intersection of human-computer interaction and the field of crisis informatics. That is the study of how social media and other information communication technologies are used during crisis events. Her work currently focuses on the production and spread of online rumors, misinformation, and disinformation during crises, including natural disasters and political disruptions. In particular, she investigates the participatory nature of online disinformation campaigns, exploring both top-down and bottom-up dynamics. She receives her BS in computer science from Stanford and her PhD in technology, media, and society from the University of Colorado. She's also the co-founder and currently serves as the director of the UW Center for an Informed Public. So as always, I'm very excited to pass things off, but a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I'll just remind everybody of the typical structure, which is that Kate will present for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have kind of an open discussion for 15 minutes or so at the end. So please feel free to leave questions in the chat if you're more comfortable with that, but we really encourage you to sort of save them for the end, and we can have a nice discussion with everybody. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing now. And Kate, let's see if we can pass things off successfully to you. Looks like we see your desktop and boom, perfect.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I am going to take a little liberty and try out some new material on you all. So I am sorry if this is a little messier than my typical slide deck. It'll be the first time I'm hitting some of these transitions, and I may miss some of them as we go. But again, I think this is the kind of audience where trying out some new material might be the right choice. So they're going to have old examples, but we're looking at them in a slightly new way. So this is an interesting time to be a researcher in online misinformation. While some have positioned this sort of problem as the most difficult challenge of our time, there's critics and contrarians that have called this focus a moral panic. And researchers in the field simultaneously have been coming under attack. Phil knows this, he's been experiencing this for a while, but coming under attack by partisan media, Substack salesmen, and Congress. And so these are interesting times, but there are also times where I feel like we are beginning to make some progress in understanding and thinking about ways to intervene in some of these processes. So as I mentioned above, I alluded to above, in January, the World Economic Forum published a report that positioned misinformation, disinformation as the most severe short-term risk in the world, and that may be a little bit overblown. A few days later, philosopher Dan Williams posted on Medium this post that sort of pushed back on that kind of positioning of misinformation as the problem rather than as a symptom of a problem. And he went on further to say that misinformation in terms of clear falsehoods are rare, and more subtle forms of misinformation are widespread and harmful, but they're not suitable for scientific study. So our team at the University of Washington bristled at that a little bit. But I want to thank Dan for helping to motivate my talk. And I agree that there's a mismatch between some of the ways we think about misinformation and how it actually manifests, especially in online contexts where it's widespread and harmful. And up until a year ago, we had pretty good data to be able to look at and conceptualize and perhaps even measure it. And that much of the misinformation research doesn't actually account for the messy nature of the actual phenomenon. But I strongly agree that these things can't be studied scientifically. And in fact, there's a long history of scientific study of rumors, which I'll draw from here in this talk. I do think Williams' criticism draws attention to some real weaknesses in the field of misinformation studies, and at least in how the field is perceived by those outside of it. One of the things that I think you all know is that the definitions themselves are dynamic, contested, and intentionally destabilized, which makes it hard to talk about things and address problems because we don't have a shared vocabulary or a shared understanding of what that vocabulary means. We know this from repeated studies and a long history of that, is that impact is hard to measure, in part due to the complexity of the phenomenon. That non-significant findings in quantitative research are often framed as there is no impact, which is a finding that seems to run counter to our lived experience. We also see that public attention and therefore perception of the field among outsiders tends to focus on big N quantitative and experimental studies in high-profile journals, and that the operationalization of misinformation in those kinds of research studies doesn't really align with the ways that misleading content actually spreads and takes shape online. And meanwhile, the qualitative and mixed method work that I think that's sort of central in the field is not always visible to outsiders in the same way as it is to insiders. So one of the things that we've been thinking about and kind of working toward is we really need better frameworks for conceptualizing, operationalizing, and communicating about the problem of misinformation, and for translating what those of us that are actually looking at this data very closely for years and years and years, translating what we know about the phenomenon to those who are operationalizing it for some of these other kinds of studies. So for more than a decade, my colleagues and I at the University of Washington have been studying online rumoring scientifically. We've had a front row seat to as misinformation and its more nefarious cousin disinformation have grown and metastasized within social media platforms and across the broader information ecosystem. And we've watched as rumors, conspiracy theories, and disinformation became pervasive online, and as journalists and other researchers converged onto the space. We were doing work before fake news was a thing, and then for several years now after the term became unusable. And we've been in the ring, sort of wrestling over these terms and definitions and what they should be. And again, we've been kind of trying to communicate. We see this criticism about the field and criticism about the research, and we're trying to communicate how like a large chunk of the field just isn't adequately conceptualizing or operationalizing the problem. And so in this talk, I'm aiming to present an emerging framework for understanding rumors and disinformation through what we've been talking about as a collective sense-making perspective. And I say it's emerging, but this is a framework that's been years in the making. I've been working on this since looking at 2010 oil spill data back in 2013 and 2014. And I was like, I think we can use collective sense making to understand conspiracy theorizing. And it's taken a long time for that to really crystallize. And really what we've been trying to do is like take the data that we're seeing of how things spread, both at the individual message level, the accounts, the networks, really kind of seeing how that spread and like, how do we conceptualize that in a way that more accurately explains what we're looking at? And we've been beginning to apply this both to educational interventions and to analysis of social media data. Now, the analyses and the quantifications of this sort of framework are still to be done. We're still coding that data, but I want to lay out sort of how we're understanding the problem because I'd love to get feedback on it. So today I'm going to provide some definitions of relevant terms really quickly. I'm going to highlight some examples, old and new, of rumors, and then describe this framework for understanding rumoring and misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theorizing as sort of collective sense making. And I'll apply that framework to some of our examples of rumors. And then if I have time, I'll try to connect this framework to the dynamic of online influencers. So definitions, you all have seen these before. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we've got definitions like misinformation, which is kind of, false information that may not be intentional, but it also serves as an umbrella term. Disinformation, which is false or misleading information purposefully seeded or spread for an objective. Some interesting things about disinformation being like it's not wholly untrue. It's often built around a true or plausible core. It often functions not as a single piece of content, but as many. And then this weird piece of the definition that we struggle with sometimes is that though disinformation is at some point intentional, someone spreading it purposefully, many of the people who get caught up become sincere believers and begin to spread it, do so as unwitting agents where they don't understand that they're part of a disinformation effort. And then conspiracy theorizing, which just is a way, a kind of a theory that tries to explain events as the result of a secret plot or conspiracy perpetrated by sinister forces. And we see those kind of repeatedly show up in a lot of our data. But I'm going to go back to an older term and one that we're finding increasingly useful. And this one comes from the social psychology research. It's got a long history back sort of World War II and a little bit prior. And this says that rumors are unofficial stories spreading through informal channels that contain uncertain or contested information. And there's a long history of this rumoring. It goes back to Allport and Postman, Shubutani. I really like Kapfer summarizing it in 2013, if anyone's interested in that. And it positions sort of rumors as a byproduct of collective sense making. And we'll define that later, but they kind of define this sort of loosely as like during times of crisis or information ambiguity, people attempt to cope with that uncertain information under conditions of anxiety. And they do that by coming together and trying to come up with explanations of what they're seeing. And those explanations are rumors. And rumors serve, in this view, aren't necessarily bad. In fact, they're just natural parts of human behavior. They serve informational, emotional, and social purposes during crisis events. Rumors can also turn out to be false. They often are, but they also can turn out to be true or somewhere in between. And about 2013, our team began to study rumoring online, and we're increasingly returning to that conceptualization rather than misinformation or something else, especially in our rapid response work, our rapid research work, where we may want to begin to work on a viral claim or story before we can determine its veracity or intent. So going back to what our first study that was just about rumoring, and to give you a few examples, because I'm going to come back and say, this is how we conceptualized it then, and here's how we're conceptualizing it now. So this is 3 rumors from the Boston Marathon bombings, and this was a horrific event in April 2013, so 11 years ago, when 2 young men detonated homemade bombs near the finish line of the race, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds. Together with the events of Hurricane Sandy, which had happened a few months prior, the bombings represented sort of a tragic inflection point in the evolution of how people were using social media during crisis events, and a point of recognition for audiences that collective sense making could go awry in online environments and lead to harmful misinformation or rumors. So using APIs that were publicly available at the time and no longer are, we collected about 10 million tweets related to the bombings. We then employed a combination of sort of network graphing, temporal visualizations, manual analyses of tweet content, sort of mixed method stuff that our team has been known for. And we used that to identify several rumors that were spreading in the conversation. We also identified, 3 what we call 3 salient types of rumors. And that was these sort of clickbaity rumors, and I'll show you what those are, sense-making rumors, and then conspiracy theories. So clickbaiting rumors were these rumors where cases where people were purposefully spreading sensational and false claims to get attention. They often included images. For example, this was a claim that a little girl was killed while running in the marathon, and it was accompanied by this image of a girl not running in the marathon. But it was something that was prominent on Google. Someone lifted the image and started spreading it in this context. It was actually the biggest rumor we saw in 2013, and it was very sticky. And we could see these bad actors beginning to recognize that they could leverage these events to gain visibility, that the attention they captured could lead to instant cash. We saw some crowdfunding, but also long-term reputational gains that they could use for something else. So the second type of rumor we saw, we referred to at the time as a sense-making rumor, and I'm going to go back to that, and because I think we were right about this, that well-meaning people were just trying to make sense of the event. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And so after the bombings, there was all this activity to try to figure out who had done it, who were the culprits. And in several cases, the crowd pointed the finger at the wrong person. And so these efforts included accusing this young man, who was a local student at, I think, Brown University, who had gone missing a few weeks prior to the bombings. Unfortunately, he had already died by suicide, but he had just not been found yet. And so he was still missing. His family was looking for him. And many people began to say that he seemed to look like the people who the FBI had pointed out in some videos that had done it. And so they started to say that he had done it. And initially it was sort of speculation, but we eventually see people actually injecting false claims into the conversation around parts of it. They said the scanner had announced his name, which wasn't, the police scanner had announced his name, which wasn't true, and other kinds of things. So this was really harmful to the family and others. And so after the event, there was this moment of collective reflection as people recognized that this sort of digital volunteerism and collective sense making that happens during crisis events can actually quickly shift to digital vigilantism. So the third category of rumor we identified at the time was this kind of conspiracy theory. So from our perspective, conspiracy theories kind of looked like collective sense making, but it was sort of a corrupted form of sense making where the theory that the event was orchestrated by secret forces was predetermined and the audience was sort of working to assemble the evidence to fit that theory. And they often relied on a set of tropes or common story elements from past events and past conspiracy theories and kind of assembled those into these claims. In this case, the claim was that the real perpetrators of the bombings were Navy SEALs or other US government agents. And in 2013, conspiracy theory seemed to be like a small part of the conversation. It was actually one of the smallest rumors in our set. And we almost didn't report on it because I didn't want to be a person who stood up and gave talks about conspiracy theories for the rest of my life. But here we all are. So let's fast forward. Okay, so those were three from Boston Marathon bombings. I'm going to come back to them. And I want to fast forward a few years to the 2020 election. Lots of things changed in the meantime. Rumors became a much more prominent part of online discourse, especially around events with uncertainties, such as crisis events, but also elections. And I want to talk about what I've been calling participatory disinformation, and we'll give it another perspective through this talk. So in 2020, when we all know this, it's around the big lie, there were hundreds of different false claims and narratives that around the election being rigged or around voter fraud or election fraud. And in these cases, elites, social media influencers, and online audiences collaborated to produce these claims. And one of those that I've talked about before, many of you probably heard me talk about before, was Sharpiegate. It's such a great example. It's hard to use another one. So this example was on election day. There were concerns that Sharpie pens were invalidating votes. And this happens where a number of people begin to post these stories, actually from all over the country, but a lot of them, a few were in Arizona initially and then more in Arizona. And they were describing how they or someone they knew or heard about had been given Sharpie pens to vote while they went in person to the polls, and how the pens had bled through the ballots and how they were worried that their votes may not have been counted. And these claims were especially salient in Arizona, a swing state where officials there attempted to correct the concerns on election day, explaining that the ballots were designed to be used with Sharpies, the bleed through wouldn't affect the vote counting. But these official statements did little to alleviate the concerns, and they grew as more people shared their fears. Initially, of the tone of these Sharpie tweets was one of actual concern, worries that the votes wouldn't count, directives to bring your own pen. But as time went on, the content took a more suspicious or accusatory tone as social media users began to interpret the evidence through a frame of voter fraud. I'll come back to those terms as we go. And eventually the discourse shifted to the explicit accusation that this was an intentional effort to disenfranchise specifically Trump voters. And that shift occurred just as the content takes off or goes viral. If we look at sort of a temporal graph of how the term Sharpie spread in election-related Twitter data on election day and the day after in 2020, the graph at the bottom here is just a tweets per minute over the course of a few days, and then at the top it's just that highlighted section right at the election day and into the day after. And it actually, during election day, yeah, so early on election day, there's just a few tweets. And there's actually people that are either seeing other experiencing it. But we begin to see it really begins to gain traction overnight after the election, in early morning hours, and probably an hour after Fox News calls the state of Arizona for President Biden. And this was a surprise to the Trump campaign, and they were looking for reasons for which they might have lost Arizona. And they begin to seize on the idea that Sharpie pens may have disenfranchised voters there. And you begin to see it get propagated and pushed out by accounts. So this top graph is a cumulative graph where I show that the total volume of tweets at that time is graphed on the y-axis, and x-axis is time, and then we plot tweets here by the size, and they're sized by the number of followers that the account has. And so we begin to see these large following accounts become engaged in the conversation, and it begins to amplify. And so this begins to go viral with the help of influencers. And what the influencers do is they find this evidence that people have shared of their Sharpies bleeding through ballots, and they post that and they amplify that. And so these influencers include political activists, media personalities, President Trump's two adult sons. And we see this pattern over and over again in 2020, where these origins of these rumors are in small accounts of people who seem to be seeing things in the world, and then they get amplified by influencers with increasingly large audiences. And Sharpiegate begins to take off with this voter fraud framing right as the rumor begins to spread widely, likely as an explanation of why President Trump had apparently lost to Biden in Arizona. We've been talking about this kind of activity as participatory disinformation, where really it's this collaboration between elites in media and politics, between online influencers who incentivize for different ways of growing reputation by kind of participating in this, and online crowds who are motivated to contribute both for reputational reasons, but also because they shared a political goals with the folks in this. And so they kind of collaborate to produce rumors that align with their political motives. And participants can become extremely invested in these narratives. And I want to show you one example of how invested they could be. So on November 4, day after the election, the Sharpiegate narrative still spreading widely. A number of people begin to share evidence in online spaces that their vote had been canceled. So they take these snapshots, they go to this online site, they put in their name, they get this little form that says their vote has been canceled, and then they share those online. This one had gone 10,000 times, been retweeted 10,000 times, as evidence that the Sharpies were invalidating votes. And so this one claims that this person's ballot she'd completed in person with the Sharpie pen had been canceled, and it appears she sincerely believes that her ballot had been canceled. But if you look more closely to the image she shared, it was captured from a website that gave people the status of their mail-in ballot, which was by law canceled when they voted in person on election day or when they didn't turn in their mail-in ballot on time. So the evidence that's spreading widely in support of these false claims about Sharpies and voter fraud, this evidence was a misinterpretation. And this misinterpretation, like so many others from misinterpretations of glitches and statistical anomalies, became wrapped up in this collective experience of being cheated. And I said at the time, this is an old slide. This is one old slide. This is one is going to be very hard to ever fully correct. And boy, were we right. Like, these folks are not going to be corrected by someone, because they really thought they were being cheated. They weren't just told they were being cheated or that they would be cheated. That many of them had this false experience of it because they were misinterpreting their own experiences. Now, why were they misinterpreting their own experiences? So here's where I'm going to get into some of the new stuff, and it's sort of offering a collective sense-making framework for understanding rumors, conspiracy theories, and disinformation. And it starts from this simple observation from our work. And that is that sometimes misinformation stems from false evidence, but more often misinformation comes in the forms of misperceptions, misinterpretations, and mischaracterizations. It's not just the evidence, it's the frames that we use to interpret the evidence that are how we become misled. And those frames are often strategically shaped by political actors and campaigns. Going back to our sort of understanding of collective sense making. So during times of crisis or times of information ambiguity. And some would argue that we're in very chaotic times with lots of information ambiguity. Despite our access to all the information in the world, there's also a lot of uncertainty. So during sort of chaotic times, people come together to attempt to make sense of the situation. These collective sense-making activities include gathering, sharing, and synthesizing information, as well as presenting interpretations, including theories about causes and impacts. This is what we do as humans. And this sense-making, if we look at this paper by Klein, which was actually, I read it over the summer, and things began to fall in place that hadn't before, that sense-making takes place through interactions between evidence, frames, and we've added in interpretations. But that the frames we have in our head shape how we select the evidence and how we make sense of it. And that the evidence can sometimes shape which frame we choose to use as we're cognitively just trying to make sense of the world. So let me explain this a little bit better. So frames, according to esteemed sociologist Irving Goffman, are mental schema that we use to interpret and give meaning to experiences. They help us put things together to make sense of the world. They help us choose which evidence is important and to interpret what that evidence means and how it fits together with other evidence, right? So our frames help us, make sense of this mess of evidence. When we have new experiences or when we encounter new evidence, we attempt to find a frame to interpret that evidence. And that frame then determines what evidence we include and what evidence we exclude in our analyses, and how we assign meaning to what those pieces of evidence are. So their frames help us interpret that evidence, and we turn those into interpretations. So this is how we make sense of information all the time. But this process can go badly when we begin to anchor on the wrong frame or unproductive frames or frames that may be leading us away from more accurate interpretations of the world. So there's one, if you had a rigged election frame and you're looking like, okay, the Sharpies are bleeding through ballots and the Sharpies were provided by election officials, and I have a frame that says the election's going to be rigged, I might interpret that as the Sharpies are invalidating my, votes as part of a voter fraud scheme. And this would be a bad interpretation. It wouldn't be true, but you could see how that happens if someone's looking at their experiences through that rigged election frame. Now, if you used a different frame, for instance, one of election integrity, we can see this bleed through was not affecting the vote count. It was not indicative of fraud. So the same evidence can be looked at with a different frame and come up with a different set of explanations. So from this perspective, and I've said this before, but maybe this will help us kind of understand a couple of different phenomena through collective sense making. So rumors, like this early part of Sharpiegate, where people are just trying to figure things out, those are just byproducts of the collective sense making process. Sense making generates rumors, these sort of interpretations, theories, and speculations. Some of these may turn out to be true. Sometimes they get things wrong. And as we go, we shift and we evolve our frames in an open sense making process to try to get closer and closer to the truth. And so if we look back to the Boston Marathon examples, Boston Marathon bombing examples, the rumors that pointed the finger at the wrong suspects, those were kind of an open sense making process that just went awry, where they anchored on the wrong theory early on, and that took them kind of down a path that was not helpful. It wasn't necessarily nefarious, but it was still harmful in this case. When we look at conspiracy theorizing, we kind of get a little bit different thing going on here. So in conspiracy theorizing, participants are repeatedly anchoring on a subset of conspiracy frames. And so they're not starting with an open-ended frame. They're not starting with a frame based on other kinds of expertise. They're really seizing on these explanations that things must be part of some kind of conspiracy with unseen actors controlling events. And each event in the world, a crisis event, becomes an opportunity to assemble evidence to fit one of those frames. We see this in the Boston Marathon bombing, that these bombs have been detonated. They have this evidence that authorities had prepared for a mass casualty event, which often happens after a marathon because a lot of people get exhausted and they need to have help. So that's true, but that's not what it means here. So the authorities had prepared for that, and that there were a group of Navy SEALs who were using the event as a training exercise, also true. And so they take this false flag frame, they go searching for and finding that evidence, assemble that into a false flag frame, and then come up with this idea that this was a false flag, that the event was perpetrated by Navy SEALs and then blamed on someone else. In crisis events, we also see them try out these different frames of crisis actors or false flag. If you know these closely, crisis actors is a slightly different conspiracy theory, and sometimes one works better than the other. So you can see the conspiracy theorists argue over which of those frames to use, but never argue over using a different set of frames, if that makes sense. So conspiracy theorizing is very common after crisis events. We've been seeing a ton of that this week after the bridge collapse. There's now there's a sort of a developed industry of production online that leverages the uncertainty and attention of these events to gain followers and monetize engagement by assembling the evidence to fit these conspiracy frames. And that's only matured since our studies of the Boston Marathon in 2013. Okay, so we've got rumors, conspiracy theories, and then we have disinformation. So we're kind of thinking about disinformation as intentional manipulation of the collective sense-making process. So disinformation is when someone's trying to shape that towards particular kinds of ends. Now, disinformation can occur through the introduction of false evidence, as we saw with the little girl running. This person eventually tries to monetize it, so their objective was money, but they're just introducing false evidence into the space, whether it's a cheap fake or a deep fake. So when we talk about how deep fakes might affect our sense-making processes, it's really on the manipulation of the evidence side, and that might lead us to select or build the wrong frames and interpret things, misinterpret things. And this was an example from about a year ago with a fake image that said it showed an attack on the Pentagon, which was not true. But disinformation can also occur through the manipulation of frames. And so that actually pays dividends in a different kind of way. So if you manipulate the frames that people have, you can actually send people out into the world, not send them, but this can cause people to misinterpret their own experiences if they're using these frames, and to generate new content for your conspiracy theories. And so in 2010, we saw elites in politics and media, including then President Trump, really set this frame of a rigged election and repeated it. It was sort of a refrain. It was repeated over and over again. And once Donald Trump supporters had that frame, they actually went out and found and created content to fit that frame, because they were misinterpreting events in the world through that false frame. And so we saw it repeated over and over again, and then this led to people misinterpreting their experiences, for example, with Sharpies bleeding through their ballots on election day. All right. And so when I've been talking about participatory disinformation, that's what it is. It's this, the audiences aren't just repeating the messages that the folks are giving them. They're actually creating content to drive those campaigns. And so it really kind of, when we get to that thing, it's like, is it misinformation or disinformation? Because the person doesn't even, they believe it, right? So they do believe it. And so the definitions get wobbly there, but it doesn't matter. What's happened is that a disinformation campaign has shaped how people are seeing the world. So let me see if I have time. Okay, I'm going to try to take time for this last piece, which I think is important, and that is the collective sense-making. Where it meets online influence, we're seeing certain kinds of dynamics develop around these intersections, and really around this activity to produce and amplify evidence to fit political frames. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot, when we see the misinformation operationalized, it's often operationalized as false claims. But when we see rumors and misinformation take shape online, it's often through evidence first, where people are just repeating evidence that they're selecting that's going to be fit into these frames by audiences that already have these shared frames, if that makes sense. So we see, leading up to the 2020 election, we saw an obsession with stories about mail-in ballots that were lost or discarded or damaged or otherwise didn't make it to voters. And these included stories about mail that was dumped by post office workers or not properly delivered, which is usually caused by them running out of time to deliver their mail. It rarely happens. It's not related to elections, and it wouldn't typically impact election outcomes because there's remedies for people getting their ballots. But in 2020, we saw influencers on the right repeatedly amplifying these stories and implying that they demonstrated that mail-in voting wasn't secure and couldn't be trusted. Now, there's nothing really false about this tweet. It's got a misleading label on it. I couldn't find a screenshot without that. But it's not misleading. I mean, it is misleading, but it's not false. And influencers like Charlie Kirk are quite good at just asking questions and avoiding taking responsibility for the implications of their content. They really just want to repeatedly amplify the evidence that fits into those frames. We saw similar dynamics on Election Day in 2022, not nationally as much, but specifically in Maricopa County, which is the same place where we had the Sharpie Gate issue in 2020, where events of the day became fodder for misleading claims. So in this case, we have a reporter actually reports that they're having problems with voting on Election Day. And this sort of shows up 17 minutes after the polls open. On a local reporter begins to share reports at the tabulation machines where people vote by hand and then they stick them into the tabulation machines. They report that one of the locations at Maricopa County, this wasn't working. Election officials were sending voters down the street. And this tweet received some amplification from the local ABC affiliate outlet. They had some large audiences. So it begins to, it begins to take off in the morning. This is real. This is really happening, right? And people begin to kind of complain about these issues pretty quickly. The extent of the issue and its cause would take some time to resolve. And I think it turned out that printer settings weren't working and some of the physical ballots had used paper that was too thick or something. But the causes, it doesn't really matter. What mattered was that this event, which happens right as the polls open in Arizona, becomes evidence to spin into conspiracy theories. And what we know in the rumoring world, in the election rumoring world especially, is that many rumors, like they flow from these real events in the world, and the details of these events drive the rumors. So about 20 minutes after the local journalist's first tweet reporting the issue, Maricopa County uses its official account to confirm and attempt to clarify the situation. They quote the initial tweet and they add that voters have 3 options to remedy the issues. And so if you're looking at the evidence at the time, there's issues of tabulating with the tabulating machines in Maricopa County. The election officials are telling voters that they can put their ballots in a box to be counted later. If you use an election integrity frame, you can look at it like sometimes there's issues with voters, but with voting, but there are always remedies. Voting issues are not typically intentional. Voting issues will rarely impact election outcomes. And you kind of can have this interpretation that issues with tabulating machines in Maricopa have remedies. They won't affect results. They're not election fraud. That's not how a lot of the audience is going to interpret this. So so 17 minutes after the polls open, okay, wait a minute. No, yeah, the local reporter, sorry, this is where my slides get a little old. Yeah, so this is just a few minutes later. Anonymized account comes and says, okay, here we go again. And so they're saying that, these voting issues in Maricopa County, these are part of a pattern, and we can't really trust the process. And so early on, this is another one of those cumulative graph parts. We've got the rumors start spreading as soon as the polls open, and they're really kind of spreading among local audiences, but they're about to really in the next hour go viral. And how do they go viral? And what goes on here really starts with this person called Tyler Bowyer. Tyler Bowyer is an Arizonian. He's a member of the Republican National Committee and also a chief operating officer at Turning Point USA, which is a conservative activist organization. And he posts this screenshot of a text message that has come in through a system of gathering reports about things that are happening at the polls. And he reports this text message from another voter who's having issues. And it says there's other issues at another location in Maricopa County. It suggests that voters are suspicious about one of the potential remedies of having their ballot taken to be counted downtown. And the author explicitly states that he or she doesn't have confidence in the process. This gets picked up a few minutes later by Arizona GOP Congressman Paul Gosar, who explains that the voters can report these kind of problems to what they call the Protect the Vote hotline that Bowyer appears to have access to. So what I'm trying to explain here way too fast is that there's an infrastructure in Arizona for people to report problems that they're having with voting, which is probably good because then we could, that could help election officials note the problems, solve the problems, find the remedies. But what this is being used to do is drive rumors, because all this content becomes evidence to drive rumors eventually false rumors, and eventually conspiracy theories about what's happening. So as this conversation starts to go on, Bowyer starts to push this out, others starts to push out different kinds of reports of issues that people are having. It begins to gain traction, and it begins to get picked up by other people with bigger accounts. So the rumors really begin to take off with Arizona GOP chairwoman Kelly Ward. Her first few tweets are just drawing attention to the problems, which again, this is something we should be doing. It's good. You want to make sure people understand there's problems there. But eventually we see seeds of suspicion and a growing conspiracy theory. First, Ward warns her audiences not to put their ballots in the box 3, so not to use the remedies and not to push the green button. So shortly after that, she tweets a leading question that the voting issues may be malfeasance, and she names Stephen Ricker, who's a Maricopa County recorder. He was actually a Republican elected in 2020 to run the elections there. He'd become a target of election deniers, and she kind of accuses him of malfeasance. And so if we look at this through the rigged election frame that begins to be kind of reflected here, is that these voting issues are corruption and negligence, voting irregularities reflect efforts to perpetrate voter fraud, that sort of rigged election. Then we get these interpretations that these issues with the machines are actually part of some sort of fraudulent effort. The first graph that I showed you was about 1,500 tweets in about an hour. In the next hour, that would go to about 50,000. And what happens is influencers all over the country, it goes from sort of local people talking about the rumors to things going all over the country. These folks begin to interact with this with a much more clearly articulated frame of voter fraud. And these are mostly large influencers in right-wing social media, partisan media, and politics. And some of these posts simply note that there's issues, which is fine, the criticism of the election officials in Arizona. But many of these posts reference and often implicitly the rigged election frame. Here's one example that we think is pretty representative of things that are happening in online spaces and kind of get a hint to how we do a lot of our research. But so one of these tweets is from right-wing influencer Jack Posobiec. And it's a leading question. It's a very common technique. Are you paying attention yet? So he's simply kind of amplifying the evidence. Are you paying attention yet? And you can understand what he's alluding to by visiting the replies or quote tweets to his comment, which is often how we see where the frames are, because the influencers are very good now at just putting the evidence out. And often you have to look to the replies to see how the audiences are assembling that evidence into the frames. And so we can see in a lot of these spaces, influencers and audiences co-producing these conspiracy theories about voter fraud and other frames as well through the promotion of the rigged election frame, the production and selective amplification of evidence that fits that frame, and the sense-making work of creating interpretations that stitch together the evidence to the frame. So we have this attention and influencer-based economy. Online influencers and partisan media they work by identifying and amplifying content that fits their prevailing frames. We can see this with border crisis and DEI is the cause of X, Y, Z, all these different frames. You can see it on the left as well. This isn't just this right phenomenon, but that these influencers actually, like, one of the roles they play is to find little pieces of evidence from local stories or individuals and places and amplify that if it fits their prevailing political frames. And everyday people, content creators, and local media are incentivized to generate content that resonates with those frames because that's how they get attention in this economy. Political operatives, especially as we shown in Arizona, but political operatives are creating infrastructures, both just sort of like online networks, but also sometimes specifically reporting infrastructures, as we see in elections, to create this evidence that can be assembled to fit the rigged election frame and other frames as well. And collective sense-making online and the production of rumors and disinformation is deeply connected to and shaped by these dynamics. Rumors and disinformation are collaboratively produced. I've said this 6 times probably, but they're collaboratively produced through interactions between elites, influencers, and audiences. And a collective sense-making approach can help us distinguish between the composite parts of rumors and disinformation campaigns and show how different actors play different roles. I'm sorry I don't have that piece here. That's the piece we're working on right now, is to kind of quantify this and show how different actors play different roles in the sense-making process, especially in online spaces. But we're hoping to be working on that in the coming months. I want to thank you all for your attention. I want to thank all the amazing students, collaborators, and funders that we've had for different pieces of this work over 10 plus years in this slide deck. And I am happy to take questions.
Wow, thanks, Kate. Went through a lot there. Appreciate the hard work. Get through it. Awesome. Yeah, so we're gonna open things up for questions. The way we typically do it is if you want to say something, you can